the chat function for any questions that you may have. We will be taking these when all the speakers have presented, or you could use your raise hand function and I'll get to your question as soon as I can. And please feel free to pop on your camera when asking your question. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Water Resources South East and Water Resources East websites afterwards, as well as being shared with the organisers of Countryside COP. So just a reminder, if you could keep your cameras and your microphones off for the duration of the webinar, please. We're also going to circulate a copy of the slides to all of those who have registered for or attended today's session, so you'll be able to have a look through those. So I'd like to start today's session by telling you a little bit about who we are as a group and why we are here to talk to you today. With the pressure of climate change, a growing population and the need to protect the environment, water resources is right at the top of the agenda. Water companies providing drinking water must produce water resource management plans, which allow them to understand forecasted supply and demand. But what about non-public water supply sectors, such as energy and agriculture? In this session today, we will be focusing on water resources for the agricultural sector. What is needed to enable the sector to better understand supply and demand, and what are the solutions to support this? And to do this, I'm joined by industry experts, Lee Dance from Water Resources South East, Daniel Johns from Water Resources East, Dr. Steve Moncaster from BAWAG, the Broadland Agricultural Water Abstractors Group, and Dr. Samantha Hughes from the South East Rivers Trust. So what we're aiming for today is to come up with 3 key asks or policy points, which the NFU, who are behind the Countryside COP movement, are able to then feed up the chain to government and regulators to make sure future water resource policy reflects the challenges and the opportunities the agriculture sector faces. So the agenda is shown on the slide now for you. The format of today will consist of around 20 minutes of presentations from those that I've just introduced and mentioned, and then we'll have around 45 minutes to answer your questions. While we welcome all questions on the topic of water resources and agriculture, we aren't able today to answer questions on specific schemes in the regional or company water resources management plans. These are really best directed to the water company in question, and you'll find more information on who they are at the end of this presentation with those contact details. So now I'm going to hand over to Lee to talk through the role of the national framework for water resources and the regional groups. Thank you, Lee.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. As Kelly mentioned, there have been statutory duties on water companies to prepare their plans for some time, but more recently, we've seen a series of reports that have made us sort of step back and look at the size and scale of the challenges we're facing, and looking at them at a more strategic and national scale. And that work sort of concluded the need to sort of shift and make some changes to the approach we're taking to address the climate and environmental challenges that are facing our environment, and to ensure that the actions that we're taking will provide resilient water supplies too for all users. The graphic on the left-hand side is from the National Infrastructure Commission's report, Preparing for a Dry Future, which was produced in 2018. And this report really highlighted a number of key things. First one being that there's a real strong case and need to invest in resilience now, rather than look at how we would manage the impact of an event as and when it occurred. It's far more cost effective and sustainable to address the issues from now and going forward. And the National Infrastructure Commission's report looked at 3 areas where that resilience could be built in. Through new infrastructure, through reducing leakage on company networks and systems by up to 50%, and through very ambitious demand management programs. In the middle of the chart here, you can see a map with some dots and lines on it. Ofwat, the Environment Agency, the Drinking Water Inspectorate have been working together under the body of RAPID and with companies to investigate some of the very strategic national level schemes that could feed in and deliver that resilience. So there's just over a dozen schemes that are being considered, and those have been feeding into the regional plans and the company plans that have recently been published and consulted upon. We've also seen the formation of 5 formal regional groups, you can see on the right-hand side, and their role has been to deliver more coordination and greater collaboration between companies at a regional scale, and that's helping to address the strategic challenges from the national work, and it's also helping to feed down and support and inform companies' water resource management plans too. We now, on the left-hand side, we now have a long-term environmental destination forecast. So we're looking much further into the future about what the challenges are for the environment. And on the bottom left-hand side, very hard to read, but you can see the bar charts that show how the water needs are distributed across the different regions. The one I'm just pointing to here on the left is Water Resource East. This one in the middle is Water Resources South East. And the green area you can see is the size of the volume and need that's coming from improving the water environment by leaving more water in the environment. On the right-hand side as well is an assessment of non-public water supply demand needs that's come from the Water Resources National Framework. Regional groups have been engaging with the multi-sectors and users to try and better understand the challenges that they're facing. And it's fair to say, and particularly in Water Resource South East's position, we're probably at the early stages of this work, and there's much more to do in the next round of planning over the next 2 to 3 years. And certainly the updates being proposed to the Water Resources National Framework are looking at how non-public water supply multi-sector users could get better support in the planning process going forward. So just turning very quickly to 2 slides about Water Resources South East. So our plan shows that if we do nothing, we would face a shortfall of up to 2.7 billion litres of water per day by 2075. Just to put that into context, the region supplies about 6 billion litres of water a day currently. As mentioned a moment ago, the bulk of that deficit, just around half, is coming from the need to leave more water in the environment. Just under a quarter is a combination of needing to build more resilience into our plans and ensure we're countering future climate change impacts. And that leaves about a third of the demand coming from growing population and household and business demand needs that are being served by public water supply. So the key headlines in terms of how we are going to bridge the gap is that leakage reduction and water efficiency play a really significant role, particularly in the early part of the plan. 2/3 of the water needs are met through demand management, the first 10 to 15 years. And over the lifetime of the plan, that it's still around 50% of water need is met through those means. That aligns with the expectations that have been set out in the Environmental Improvement Plan targets that have been published recently. And it will rely on a lot of things working together around technology, behaviour, government interventions as well. And so we will need to really carefully track and monitor the progress being made. Demand management on its own won't provide all the requirements we need. And so in the early parts of the plan, we see Havant Thicket Reservoir being developed in Portsmouth Waters area, a number of water recycling schemes. And we start to see the development of one of those very large strategic schemes that Rapid have been looking at, the Grand Union Canal, bringing water into the region. From 2035 to 2075, we see some further water recycling schemes. We see more storage being developed in Oxfordshire and in Kent. And we see the construction of 6 desalination plants as well. And you can see there the cost of the plan over the lifetime. And I think it's really important to underline the work that NIC did, which showed that the cost of not trying to deliver these plans or not delivering these plans at pace is far greater in terms of impacts on the environment and on customers. So it's really key we keep a focus on the delivery of the plan going forward. So I'll now pass to Daniel Johns from Water Resources East.
Yeah, thanks, Lee, and morning, everybody. So I'm Daniel Johns, I'm Managing Director of Water Resources East, and I'm going to be building on what Lee's just been saying about the regional planning process, what that looks like for Water Resources South East, to bring in the kind of multi-sector dimension, particularly for agriculture, given how important agricultural production is to the region and to the economic production of the east of England. And I guess it's no surprise to show the map on the left-hand side here shows how intensive agricultural abstraction and irrigation is across East Anglia into Cambridgeshire and up in Lincolnshire. And on the right-hand side, just what a big share of the regional water resource demand in the next couple of years will be accounted for by spray irrigation, so about 190 million litres of water per day. Against obviously a much larger share for the public water supply, but still within our region, spray irrigation is a significant proportion of the water demand, and which will only increase in changing climate. And of course, when you get into particular seasons and particular catchments, irrigation is the largest user of water in parts of the east of England. But we have a problem, we have a challenge that the environment is over abstracted, aquifers are depleted, rivers run dry, we don't have the flows that support good ecology. And so as Lee's just been saying, we need to move toward an environmental destination by 2050, that allows enough water in nature to be left in nature for the environment to thrive. And so the chart on the screen here shows you three progressively deep reductions in abstraction licenses for agriculture in order to improve the environment. On the left-hand side, it might be considered a kind of do minimum scenario that meets kind of existing legislative requirements, kind of holds back further deterioration, makes improvements in some cases. But if we're going to restore aquifers, river levels to the level that is needed to support good ecology across the whole of the region, we need to move to the right-hand side, which of course also implies the deepest reductions in agricultural licenses. And these are average reductions in abstraction volumes. When you get down to individual license holders, individual kind of sub-catchments, then the cuts are really quite deep indeed. And in some cases will require the total removal of abstraction rights, even where kind of permanent licenses are in place. And that process is already starting to unfold in parts of Norfolk. So we've got a challenge. We need more water. Demand is increasing. Climate change means potentially there are opportunities for agriculture in longer kind of growing seasons, different types of crops, higher value crops being grown. So this chart shows for the public water supply in this case what we expect to play out. And I guess the main point is that we don't have a similar chart at this stage for the agricultural sector. So the blue line shows that demand for water is going to be growing with the rising population. And the green line at the bottom shows how much water is available for use as and when those cuts in abstraction licenses start to kind of be brought in from the late 2020s and through in particular in the 30s through to the 2040s. So we have a very large supply demand deficit that we expect to emerge for the public water supply, not in like 15, 20, 25 years, but actually over the next kind of 5 years or so. And that needs to be addressed. And that's why within our water resources plan, our draft plan that WRE published last December, we showed exactly how that kind of emerging supply demand deficit for the public water supply could be met. And on the left hand side, you see a map of the different options as they emerge through the east of England to make sure that public water supply has increased drought resilience. We return to the environment the water that nature needs, and we also meets the kind of growing needs of the population and those sectors of the economy that use the public water supply. And what we need to do is create kind of more localized catchment and even more localized schemes than that support the growing supply demand deficit for agriculture. And I guess the point of this chart is that many of the options that we're thinking about from the public water supply perspective also apply to agriculture, but potentially at a smaller scale. So water efficiency is going to be incredibly important, and thinking about how water is used, not wasted, used more efficiently through different types of irrigation, through monitoring much more closely how soil moisture deficit emerges and can be managed. Thinking about different water efficient crops and varieties, and also exploiting the opportunities of indoor and vertical farming. But overall water efficiency has to be the first best answer for managing these water supply demand deficits. But we also need to use much more and kind of recycle and reuse the water that does fall within the east through rainwater, thinking about the drainage water that the IDB pump out into sea during the winter months. Can more of that be captured and stored? And also there's significant untapped potential, I think, for effluent reuse. Anglian Water has more than 1,000 water recycling centres across the region. And whilst not all of those will be possible to tap into, some of those sources, because the water is needed to augment river flows, particularly during the summer. But potentially there is, potentially hundreds of different sites across the east of England where farm businesses might be able to tap into that water with the agreement of the Environment Agency, and of course with a long-term agreement with Anglian Water. But a lot of this is about more storage within the landscape through winter storage reservoirs, through managed aquifer recharge. And also there's some interesting pilots looking at how you can use existing kind of drainage channels and drainage infrastructure to hold water back much more kind of routinely, so that you create a kind of whole farm approach to reservoir storage. And I think, again, maybe I think Steve might get into this as well about the potential for water sharing, water trading, but at least farm businesses to work together in clusters to share water between them from year to year to season based on their kind of changing demands. Because if everyone sits on their own abstraction license, the chances are that's going to run out relatively frequently. But if you pool those needs, pool those resources, invest in shared infrastructure, you'll probably find those farm clusters become much more resilient to the types of environment and drought conditions we're seeing more frequently in future. So as my set of policy asks, if that's what this session is aiming to identify, first of all, it's been true of the past that regional water resource groups like Water Resources East, Water Resources Southeast, we've not been funded to look at these multi-sector water resource challenges. We don't have funding from government, but that conversation has begun. So one of the kind of first asks is make sure that we are properly funded to commission the studies and to support local searches for resource options, working with the abstractor groups to be able to fill these growing supply demand deficits. And we also know it's really difficult to get some of these quite, in so many cases, straightforward, sensible solutions through the planning system and through the process of securing abstraction licenses from the Environment Agency, for example, to fill winter storage reservoirs. And they're quite risk averse when it comes to capturing rainwater, other sources of water, and allowing that to be put back into the ground as aquifer recharge. And of course, they're also quite risk averse to the reuse of effluent, of treated effluent for non-potable uses, like for agriculture, for irrigating golf course and so forth. So there's certainly a lot of work needed with planning authorities, perhaps with government and also the Environment Agency, to make sure we streamline and accelerate process for bringing these new local resource options forward. But we're also really excited about the potential for nature-based approaches to help support groundwater infiltration, support base flows, so that hands-off flow conditions are imposed less frequently. And we hope in the autumn statement today there'll be some announcements around how we might be working in Cambridgeshire in particular to open up a new nature-based front to help groundwater recharge, to build on the work we're already doing with the Rivers Trust, the Norfolk Rivers Trust, around our Norfolk Water Strategy with Anglian Water, Nature Conservancy and Norfolk County Council. So that's it for me. I'm going to be handing, I think, on to Steve to take us through some of these options in more detail at a local level.
Great, thanks, Daniel. So for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Steve Mulcaster and I'm Membership and Technical Advisor for BOAG, a group of abstractors in Northeast Norfolk. I've just got a couple of slides this morning, and the first one is really about why it's important that agriculture as a sector engages with the national framework and the next round of regional planning. Irrigated agriculture is part of a large £4 billion a year fruit, vegetable and ornamental sector in the UK, and obviously critical to food security. The amount of water we use in irrigated agriculture varies between about 70 and 160 million metres cubed per year, depending on the weather. And at the top end, that's around 440 megalitres a day. About a third of what Anglian Water would put into supply in a dry year, or around 3 times what Cambridge Water would put into supply. So although in sort of national terms the amount of water used in agriculture is relatively small, it's still a significant amount. And of course, abstractors within the sector are still exposed to climate risk and the need to return water to the environment to meet current and future environmental needs. So although we're a bit smaller, we've got all the same problems. When you look at things like the recently published DEFRA water plan, they talk about supporting the sector with investment in storage, equivalent to something like an increase in 60 or 70% over what we have at the moment. That's a number that we sort of sense checked. We know it's to do with environmental need and managing increase in frequency and severity of drought. When we look at what that might cost, we can see sort of capital expenditure of up to 500 million. Once you understand that, you can see you're immediately faced with a whole set of water resource planning issues. You know, what kind of options do we have? And Daniel's sort of referred to them. Where and when should they be delivered? So we obviously wouldn't go out and do it all in one go. We have to think about phasing for delivering these new assets. Who pays and how much is going to be quite an important question. The model that we have at the moment sees quite a bit of grant support coming into the sector. A £500 million ask would require twice what we're getting in the water management grant every year for the next 25 years. So there's clearly issues around funding tied up with this, and the replacing, you know, up to 70% of the current capacity doesn't include anything about growth. So growth's on top of that. So we were largely absent from the first round of regional planning. We've clearly got a set of issues that require us to be present in the second round of planning. The way we've set ourselves up to do that is basically to look at connecting the base, right, individual abstractors to a process which then links up through regional planning into the upper parts of the national framework and then to DEFRA. And that's really important because whereas there are something like 22 water companies in England with a statutory process for delivering water resource management plans, in agriculture there are 12,000 odd agricultural licenses that are held and no equivalent statutory process for planning. So really the key to effective participation in the next round of regional planning is to connect to the base and make sure that the base is organised, individual abstractors are organised, so they can access regional planning and start to play a role in the kind of things that I've just described. If we're able to do that, and the key element is creating a network of water abstractor groups. If we're able to do that, we can then go from abstractor, water abstractor group, regional planning, national framework, DEFRA, Secretary of State, and we think it's that sort of line of sight up and down which will really help get the base, get individual abstractors motivated and get them interested in water resource planning in a way that perhaps they aren't at the moment. Okay, that's my two slides. So I'm happy to hand over to Samantha. Sam.
Hi. Yes, wait a minute, let's move on with my slides. Hi everyone, I'm Sam Hughes. I'm a Senior Water and Land Stewardship Officer at the South East Rivers Trust, and really carrying on in the vein of connecting to the base, I'm going to be talking about the Holistic Water for Horticulture project, which is where we are working in collaboration with RAP, with the horticultural sector in the southeast in Kent. And this is very much the delivery and scoping end of everything we've talked about in the webinar today. So giving it some context, the southeast, and the slide here, the map here shows the Medway in particular, where there are a lot of horticultural growers, a lot of polytunnels. The southeast is already water scarce. Climate change is going to make this situation even worse, that and population growth. And horticultural businesses are heavily water reliant for precision irrigation. So a lot of the bodies that they abstract from under climate change are highly threatened. So it's a case of working with growers and retailers across the supply chain in the southeast for a more resilient supply chain and helping to future-proof businesses. The Holistic Water for Horticulture project is one of several RAP funded projects and water roadmap projects across the UK, where it's to do with working to protect water resources in critical sourcing areas. So retailers sign up to a voluntary agreement for collaborative action and to help basically fund our roles to deliver a series of solutions on farm, which involves us visiting farms and drawing up farm plans and scoping for measures. Of course, this will contribute to a more resilient supply chain, and the overarching target of the water roadmap is that 50% of the UK's fresh food will be sourced from areas with sustainable water management by 2030. So there's a lot of work to do in the next 7 years. The ambition of the Holistic Water for Horticulture project is broken down in this sort of Venn diagram. So what we're looking at is supporting resilience, working with businesses in the sector through free farm visits and free farm plans, where we, on a case-by-case scenario, will visit and talk to a grower about ways to improve water self-sufficiency. This could be rainwater harvesting and looking at storage options. It could be looking at nature-based solutions to slow down the flow on certain farms where there might be problems with erosion that will affect areas downstream. There are also measures that can improve soil quality, so that will help with groundwater recharge, and also to enhance biodiversity. Of course, in turn, these will then support the catchment and help make the sourcing catchment healthier. And there are lots of ways that we can develop up these schemes through the different funding pathways that we help connect the growers with. So we use an approach based on desktop work, where we look at we use different types of tools, from risk mapping through to tools that allow us to look at what's going on individual sites, and we can help, for example, scope for areas where reservoirs or nature-based solutions can be developed and delivered. We use tools, there are some very good rainwater harvesting tools that have been developed, for example, by Cranfield, and also there's a tool online available through Kent County Council, where we can look at how rainwater harvesting can offset mains water use. We engage on site and develop and deliver a series of water measures that I described in the previous slide, but we also share knowledge, so that will be through a project platform, workshops and newsletters. So if anyone in the Southeast is interested in a farm visit, you've got my email address, and we look forward to hearing from you. I think that's me done.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to all of our speakers for laying out the challenges the agriculture sector faces. I thought they were all fascinating, so thank you very much for your time today and for really pointing out the tools which could be available to support the solutions for future resilience. So once again, thank you. We have had a number of questions come in and submitted, A, in advance and B, on the chat. So I'm going to start the questions. We're going to open the questions up now for around 45 minutes. So if you would like to post a question into the chat, if you haven't done so already, then please do so, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. So I'm going to start with one that was already posted, and I'm going to signpost this to Sam, to yourself. So this is from Ord Pantel, who says, what are your thoughts on the integration of sustainable farming practices with other policy objectives around local nature recovery, biodiversity net gain, as well as reducing water demand?
Yes, I like this question, and I can only say that I think it's a good thing, because nature-based solutions, for example, bring multiple benefits, and this needs to be fully recognised. But I think this is something that needs to be effectively brokered. There needs to be good brokerage, and there has to be transparency about how it works and what the limitations are. I think there's a lot of frustration at the moment around moving goalposts and sliding deadlines. But I don't think that these things can be really considered in isolation. So I think the integration pathway is the way to go, but we need transparency.
And collaboration really is a word that I'm sure we'll use quite a lot through all of our conversations today and going forward, isn't it? Thank you, Sam. There's a question, well, there's sort of two questions that have come in that are quite similar. So if I can direct this to maybe Steve and Daniel, but the first part of the question is from Alexander Galloway, who says, how will abstraction license capping withdrawal be prioritised? But then another question that came in on the chat was from Luc Zivel, who says, Daniel, would you know the numbers for different environmental scenarios for the reductions in abstraction that will be required relative to actual abstraction for agriculture during the last significant dry summer? So there's sort of two parts of the question there about abstraction. Steve, can I come to you first, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kelly. So the answer to the question on prioritisation of licence reductions is that we're working with the agency to understand their process through to about 2035, actually, when we think we get to the end of the first round of catchment reviews. And that process will actually, I think, result in reductions around sort of meeting future environmental needs. Within that period, between now and 2020 to 35, there's some couple of milestones that we already sort of picked out. One is 2028. Well, actually, it starts with transition to permits, which we think is next year. 2028 is the loss of compensation rights for revocation of permanent licenses or permits. So we think that's actually quite a key milestone, because once you get beyond 2028, then the agency really are in a different space when it comes to getting water from extractors back into the environment. And it's really beyond that point that we think this process will accelerate. So there is an exception to that. So at the moment in the Broads, we're seeing stuff which is front-ended, which will result in changes a lot sooner than 2028. But I think for most people, it's that period 2028 through to 2035 when you'll see capping and reductions and other things.
Thanks, Steve. And just before I come to Daniel for the second question, the second part of that question, you mentioned sort of water abstractor groups and the role that they could play in this process. If we've got, abstractors on the call today who aren't part of a water abstractor group, because we know there aren't many across the country, who should they get in touch with? How can they start up an abstractor group in their area? What's the process of that?
That's great. Thanks, Kelly. So, the other part of my job is actually working with something called Water for Food Group, which is a national level organisation where agri-food abstractors and other people linked to abstraction in the agri-food sector sit down with the agency in DEFRA to talk about issues like planning and droughts and things like that. The Water for Food Group's in the middle of sort of repurposing itself, and it's really supporting the sort of stuff that I laid out in the couple of slides that I gave. And a key activity for the Water for Food Group will be setting up this network of water abstractor groups. So we want to use the existing abstractor groups really to get into other areas where spray irrigation and abstraction for agriculture is important, and help those abstractors in those areas to set their groups up. So that's a priority for the Water for Food Group, and we are developing tools for abstractors that will help them build organisational capacity, but also start to get into the more technical elements of water resource management planning. So I think a lot of that will happen actually next year, Kelly. So 2024, key date for that.
Brilliant, fantastic, thank you. Daniel, could I come to you regarding that second part of the question, regarding the environmental scenarios and the numbers?
Yes, absolutely.
you.
Well, just first of all, to really kind of emphasise what Steve was talking about in terms of the Water for Food Group and the work they've been really commissioning over the last year to get agricultural water resource planning up to the standard that water companies have been kind of at for some time now. That's a really exciting piece of work. And again, today's autumn statement will hopefully announce some funding to take that kind of work to the next stage, to look at kind of catchment scale, supply demand balance assessments for agriculture, and then to commission work to develop local resource options to get them through the feasibility stage so that funding applications and grants might be able to come forward. So that's already happening now in a way that just wasn't happening perhaps a year or so ago. And again, Kelly, in your previous role at the NFU, you were instrumental in getting the energy behind that agenda, as well as Steve and many others. I think just on terms of abstraction licenses, again, as Steve is saying, this process has already begun, that in many cases, licenses have been capped, excess headroom has been removed. And when it comes to surface water abstraction licenses, many people have already have had to accept hands-off flow conditions being applied to surface water licenses that with climate change you can expect to be triggered more and more frequently, in the changing climate with hotter, drier summers, warmer, wetter winters. And as Steve says, 2028 is a really key date where permanent licenses could be changed without compensation, and the kind of the bar for being able to change licenses without compensation is being reduced as well. So in the past, permanent licenses could only be changed if they were being shown to have a deterioration, having a kind of a really significant impact on the environmental health of water bodies. Now it's just about whether or not permanent licenses are kind of preventing the government achieving its kind of long-term environmental improvement goals. That's a much lower bar for the government to jump before they're able to change those licenses. And we'll have, say, permanents coming in for next year, and then a process of kind of 6 yearly reviews for all licenses. So even permanent licenses, those that remain after 2028, will probably in effect become time limited in any case. And just as in terms of kind of painting the picture of how that might play out within catchments, we'll see, say, surface water licenses constrained more frequently through hands-off flows. We'll probably have less upstream abstraction and potentially, more ability for abstraction downstream. And of course, groundwater licenses being reduced and having to be replaced with storage, particularly in the upper catchments. And there's the question about what that means for actual license volumes. And so the chart that I presented was based on kind of license volumes rather than actual abstraction. But because headroom has probably already been removed and will start to be reduced further, then there's probably less difference, I suppose, between the license volumes and the actual abstraction, particularly in those dry years. So we are talking about 40, 50, 60% reductions on average, and in individual cases 80, 90, if not 100% reduction in abstraction volumes.
And I think that really just goes to highlight the importance of abstractors being part of water abstractor groups, of really being able to liaise with the Environment Agency, to be able to understand what is coming down the line, to be able to plan. So looking at these, water resource management planning mechanisms to be able to support their businesses. Thanks, Daniel. Thank you, Steve. Lee, I want to bring you in, please. Just a question from Jilly Hall that's come in. It'd be interesting to hear how the partnership has considered issues surrounding the concept and understanding of equity, and how this is communicated to those who feel like they're winners and those who feel like they're losers in the water resource allocation. Are you all right to take that one, Lee?
Oh, big question, really good question as well. So I think we're on a little bit of a journey with it. So if I just look at public water supply for a moment, I guess the fact we've now got these long-term forecasts of what we would need to do in terms of making improvements to the environment and understanding what would be required and developing plans. So I guess in that sense, we've been trying to look at the best where the priorities should be and how they should be phased and which ones come through. Which ones come through first, and that sort of gets funded and delivered through the overall company plan. So there's sort of an equity in that sense. I think what we're talking about today and the non-public water supply piece, I think Steve's made some good points, as has Daniel. We're still at the very early stages of understanding what those impacts might need to be, and we're still at the early stages of understanding what funding mechanisms might be put in place and what support might be put in place as well. So I think it's a hard question to answer precisely now, but I think that we're on the journey, and I think it's through that process that there will need to be better understanding of where the greatest benefits can be achieved and how there's support and funding to deliver them. I don't know whether the other guys had anything to add to that, but I think that's sort of where I see us at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lee. And I think, Jerry Knox just put something in the chat that just to pick up on that, when we start looking at the solutions that are potentially available to the agricultural sector, some of them are restrained due to the water regulatory framework. So specifically looking at, abstraction regulation. And Steve, Sam, you might, want to come in here on that. But, is there any work that's been done by anybody to look at the, liaising with the Environment Agency, specifically on that regulatory framework to look at the changes needed in abstraction regulations, such as more flexibility, local control, water sharing? What does that look like?
So I think at a policy level, that's the kind of stuff that we want to do through the Water Food Group. So if we kind of take ourselves out of individual catchments and projects and think about sort of change at the highest level, that's one of the reasons why we're really sort of repurposing Water Food Group and thinking about the way the sector engages with the national framework, because at some point you do get into those issues, and we need some kind of vehicle, to be able to raise them and then deal with them. On the coming back to the question about equity, I think it is really an interesting point to raise. So certainly in agriculture, we feel a bit disadvantaged at the moment. We don't have the resources that are available to the agency and the water companies. We don't have the track record in water resource management planning, and the statutes, so the regulations, are actually geared up towards the agency and the water companies. And if you look for anybody else in the regulations, there's just a big gap. So nobody else is kind of mentioned. Experience from the first round of regional planning tells us that collaboration is really difficult. Okay, it's easy word to say. In practice, it's very difficult to do, especially at a regional scale that translates into something that's nationally significant. So I think one of the things that ought to come out of the next round of planning is just, something that feels like levelling up, to use that term. Something that puts the sectors in a better place relative to each other, so that ultimately we do get better plans out for the catchments and the systems that we abstract from. So I think for those of us in agriculture, this point about equity is quite close to front of mind for us, and it's something that we're going to have to deal with.
Great, thanks, Steve. Sam, a question just coming to yourselves regarding the RAP project. Is that going to be, does that cover all regions, all areas? You mentioned sort of a specific area for the RAP project, but is it a regional, national project?
It's an international project, in fact. They're initially started, it's got to be about 5 years ago now, with just specific regions across the UK. I think there were initially 6 or 7. But it has now gone into a new period of planning and delivery. And I think, and there's somebody on the call that maybe you can call me up if I got the numbers wrong, but they are looking to expand in the UK to at least 20 more sourcing areas and catchments. So there is a definite drive for upscaling and rolling out this approach. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. A question from Liz McCallum to Steve. What role do hydroponics have in the future?
So that's interesting. So I looked at this because we've got a list of questions, right? And I looked at this and thought, how am I going to answer anything about hydroponics? Fortunately, last week I was in southern Spain looking at agricultural systems down there. And what I was reminded of is that a lot of the food that we eat in England, a lot of stuff like salads, is actually grown overseas in places that are probably more climate vulnerable than we are here. So I can actually see quite a future for hydroponics, because I think as supply chains become less resilient, right, as these people who produce food in other places for us deal with their own problems around climate and the rest of it, there is an opportunity for hydroponics in the UK. So I think that's going to be something quite interesting to look at in the next few years.
Brilliant, thanks, Steve. I'm just going to come to Sam and Lee on the next one. Sam, you talked quite a lot about sort of the horticulture sector in your presentation, along with sort of Steve as well. But have you considered horticultural uses in terms of that many of those businesses rely on mains water? So how does that impact on the relationship with the water companies when we start to look at water resources regional planning? And what are solutions for those to move away potentially from mains water and the reliance on mains water? What do those solutions look like? And then Lee, if you want to come in from a water company perspective, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, rainwater harvesting is pretty much the way to go for most growers at the moment. It's retrofitting is quite an expensive procedure, and the water companies at regional level are becoming more and more involved in funding capital costs for rainwater harvesting and storage on site. I think I mentioned when I was presenting the slides, there are some very, very handy tools out there as well that can help you calculate how beneficial it would be for your business in terms of the area that you can potentially harvest rainwater from, and also your storage volumes. So you can run through scenarios with some very nice tools. There was one developed by Jerry Knott and his team at Cranfield, and there's an online calculator for that's promoted, has been developed by Kent County Council. So these are all tools that can help you make your decision. I think I could then pass on to, was it Lee?
Lee, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Sam's covered it all really well there. I mean, the one thing I'd say is it's also trying to look a bit broader as well. So if you look at the rainwater harvesting systems that I've seen examples of on some of the work that Sam's done, and that they're also looking at how they can help and support manage runoff, how you can install leaky dams and make other modifications to hold water up. They can have benefits to water companies in terms of helping with flows on rivers and links in with licensing. So I think it's just a huge area that everyone's very interested in starting to get into a lot more.
Brilliant, thank you. There's a couple of related questions that's come in from Leah Matthews Collins that I'm just going to ask. One of those is, and still talking about the solutions side, new solutions. Can the water companies fund winter storage reservoirs and rainwater harvesting schemes to reduce the constraints on public water supply? So keeping with that theme of how do we move businesses away from PWS, are water companies funding those opportunities and options?
Yeah, so I've been away directly from what companies have been doing for a short while now, but I am aware that a lot of companies are running programs where they're working with farmers. They're looking at a catchment scale level. They're looking at runoff management and management of how crops are being used on site and those sort of things. So I think these things are already happening. What's really interesting is what's coming along to support that as well. So we were talking a little bit earlier about the Water Resources National Framework review that's being undertaken at the moment, and there's a lot of discussion coming through about local resilience options, and they sort of dovetail and tie in with those as well. So I think there'll be several different routes in. So companies are doing stuff at the moment, but I think there'll be other routes as well.
Great, thank you. And Steve, just to come to you on the second question from Leah, are you, as an agricultural sector, working with the planning system to ease the way for reservoirs to get planning?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is yes. So we've been dealing with those issues up in Norfolk the last sort of 18 months, and what we've seen actually is a system which is very difficult for individual abstractors to manage. It requires you to sort of coordinate planning applications with license applications and applications for grant funding as well. And it's really tricky to get all of those things to line up so that actual investments in storage go ahead in the sort of timescales that we need them to. So that's a real problem for us at the moment, something that needs to be sorted out.
Thank you. And it came back to sort of, Daniel, your last slide of your presentation, which you looked at your 3 key asks. Number 2 was streamlining the process for local resource options. So certainly that's something at the forefront of all your minds.
Yeah, and that's right. As Steve says, we've been working with BAWAG, with Environment Agency, with Anglian Water, and with the local planning authorities in the Ant Valley to try and streamline the process of getting these winter storage reservoirs through the planning system, through the Environment Agency's approval of new licenses, and also in the context of the Cambridge Delivery Group process, using the opportunity to raise that directly with ministers as well. So I know DEFRA are alive to this. Obviously, it's one of those issues that cross departmental boundaries. So it does need to be a kind of shared solution between DLUP and DEFRA.
Thank you. A question that's come in from Rachel Butler is, we've talked quite a lot about new solutions, so building reservoirs, looking at nature-based solutions, etc. But actually, a big part of for a water company is looking at demand management. And Rachel's question is, what collaborative actions have been undertaken or are being undertaken to reduce demand in the agricultural sector? Can I, Steve, can I come to you first, and then I can go through to Daniel or Lee?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, Daniel talked about a load of technology that allows us to do that kind of thing. So trickle, drip, other rainwater harvesting, things like that, which is all fine and stuff that will sort of emerge and be adopted where it's appropriate to adopt it. I think the other thing actually that is going to happen is around capping of licenses, and I think once you kind of strip out all of that headroom that the sector carries, and the work that Jerry's done has shown that there is quite a lot of headroom in agricultural licenses. Once that goes, I think people will look much more closely at patterns of water use, and from that will emerge sharing and trading. And much more sort of efficient and effective use of the resources that we have available. So I think technology is one thing, but actually the changes around licensing will drive a whole set of other kind of responses, which in practice might be the bigger win, I think, once we get into it.
Right. Daniel, Lee, do you want to add anything to that from your perspective?
Well, just to say there are quite a few examples of that already happening, as Steve says, and as based on Jerry's work at Cranfield, that sharing water between adjacent users makes your supply much more resilient to the kinds of conditions we're going to be seeing even more frequently in future. People's need for irrigation changes year to year depending on kind of crop rotation patterns. You can kind of get together with your neighbours at the beginning of the year to pitch in how much water you think you need based on the kind of crops you've got that kind of being planted, and then obviously sharing the cost of that shared infrastructure. So there's the Lincoln Water Transfer Limited option. That example is a really clear one where local farmers have created a business which works very closely with the Internal Drainage Board to invest in shared infrastructure and say have this kind of pooling system, which also then fairly shares the cost of maintaining those assets between the farm businesses. And that's exactly the kind of options that Steve's talking about. Is exactly the kind of options we think will be necessary to manage these kind of supply resilience challenges going forward.
Right.
If I can just add to that, Kelly, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
I think there's a much broader point here, which is the opportunity we have in agriculture to join sort of water management with land management and the sort of agenda that's emerging around elms, because the basic point is the better sort of condition these catchments are in, and the better our triple SIs are functioning and all the rest of it. That the less requirement there is to intervene on with abstractors and cut back on their abstraction. So you can't really do this stuff without also thinking ultimately what it's for, and it is about delivering catchments which are more climate resilient and basically in better condition than they are now. And that I think is one of the biggest things that we can do to secure access to water in the future. We need to be making that connection and exploiting those opportunities.
Thanks, Steve. We have got somebody that's raised their hand. So Robert Ledbury, if you want to take yourself off mute, and if you'd like to pop your camera on and ask your question, please do go ahead. I'm going to go to another question in the chat, but if you want to come back, Ronald Ledbury, you're more than welcome to. So I'll go to the chat for another question and then I'll come back. There's sort of two questions, one from Mark Manning, one from Kathy Sales, that are quite similar in terms of how is flood and drought being dealt with in an integrated collaborative approach of, how can that work better, I guess. So how can we adapt to climate change is sort of the crux of the question. So Lee, could I come to you and then to Sam, please?
Yeah, so I think there's more and more focus, certainly by water companies and with partners, looking at how catchments are functioning and systems are functioning. So I think that's a key area where better understanding the challenges within the catchment and looking at those options, and seeing how they can deliver multiple benefits is probably key to that. And I'll just go back to the bit I mentioned earlier with the work that Sam's been doing as a good example to kind of paint the picture a bit more, but where you're looking at things like capturing of rainwater and leaky dams and other bits and pieces, you have the ability to see how you can maybe at scale start to develop those in and make the systems work better. So I think it's doing some of that, more of that work, and having more focus and drawing on the support and the funds that are starting to come through and emerge to do that is key.
That's great. Thanks, Lee. Sam, would you like to add anything to that, please?
Yes, I think obviously we have catchment partnerships and a catchment-based approach. So the catchment partnerships work on a particular catchment. There's a catchment management plan that recognises where certain issues have to be addressed, like flood and drought, and helps to focus through the catchment management plan what sort of measures and who can help to develop and deliver them. So that's a very important role that, for example, all the regional rivers trusts play a part in.
And certainly you mentioned catchment partnerships there, and if anybody on the call would like to find out more, they can certainly go online, and there's lots of information there about the work that the catchment partnerships do and how you can contact them and be involved with that conversation. And just on sort of floods and droughts, Jerry Knox has put something else in the chat, and just looking at how we do need to think more holistically about floods as well as droughts, particularly when we're looking at risk management and planning. So Daniel, did you want to come in?
Yes, please. Yeah, no, absolutely. So we need to make our catchments less flashy. We've just had a really wet couple of months, and the internal drainage boards have been working absolutely full pelt to pump all that excess water out to the North Sea. Millions and millions of litres of water being pumped through St Germans and other those major pumping stations along the east coast. And we know from the Felixstowe Hydrocircle project that you can capture a lot of that rainwater, you can bring it back up into the catchment, store it for later use during the season. So a lot of the answer is making our catchments less flashy, increasing the amount of storage within the landscape, and just to get another plug for nature-based solutions, which help potentially to achieve both of those things, that help kind of capture the excess rainfall, store it, allow it to naturally infiltrate into the ground, supporting base flows, and just to say kind of slowing down the process of water kind of flowing. flowing through our catchments. And I think it's really important that internal drainage boards, we and many others now are recommending that internal drainage boards take on a formal role in water resources management, as well as kind of flood risk and water level management, that you manage drainage catchments much more intelligently. You manage higher water tables also to help with soil health, and particularly where you've got areas of lowland peat. And I think that's one of the recommendations that we made to government in our last report, which is echoed by Robert Caldwell in the Lowland Peat Task Force report, that the government accepted those recommendations in the summer, and we hope that perhaps some of the legislative options will come through in due course.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And Steve, just coming to you, there's two follow-up questions to the conversation that we're just having there about sort of climate change, floods and droughts. So the first one from Luke Zivell: should there be a drought plan for farmers for level 4 type conditions, and whose plan should this be?
So the short answer is yes, and it should be a farmer's plan. So it should relate to individual businesses or groups of businesses, so that they know exactly what they're doing when we go from a dry year to a drought. At the minute, I mean, that is just not understood at all, and I think it's a bit of a problem when you're basically considering 500 million quid's worth of investment, and what is it for? Is it for dry years or is it for droughts? And before you start spending any money, you really have to understand the difference between the two.
And I think, the Water for Food group that you mentioned earlier, we're very much instrumental in pulling together a framework for a drought plan for agriculture, weren't they? So, there is something being developed, and, certainly seen as a gap that we need something to be able to support the sector and support the conversations that are needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think historically the sector's relied on abstraction regulations being sort of relaxed in drought conditions. I just don't really see that being acceptable going forward. I think lots of people will start objecting to that, and there will be pressure to develop drought plans and then use them.
The challenge there, Steve, is if we don't have the water, there can't be the flexibility to take the water if it isn't there. So that wouldn't work in that situation, as you mentioned, sort of going forward. Just following up, sorry, Steve, to keep with you, there was a question just to follow back on, you mentioned about elms, and this sort of follows on the nature-based solutions point as well. But do you feel, it's from Alexander Galloway, do you feel that elms is sufficiently joined up to work as you outlined?
No, I mean, no, it's not at the minute. They're still treated very separately, or appear to be, certainly from our perspective. We think that there's huge opportunities to join agricultural WRMPs with elm type schemes. And as we sort of go into this round of planning and go from understanding our investment need to the range of options that are available, we'd expect a serious amount of effort to go into joining elms with new sets of rules around abstraction and catchment. You really have to do both, I think.
Great, thanks, Steve. Sam, to come to yourself, there's a question from Fiona Thompson. How will regional water resources planning support the economic sustainability of the agri-food system? How will it contribute to food security? And are there wider ways it can support other than ensuring sufficient quantity of water?
That's quite a long question. Can you say it? Can you repeat it, please, Kelly?
Yeah, so the first part is really about how is regional water resources planning supporting the economic sustainability of the agri-food system and food security?
Well, I think
that's the first part.
Yeah, I think that's really to do with the multi-sector groups, with the maybe Water Resources Southeast, and getting more involvement maybe going on there. Maybe Lee could give more information on that. Certainly that would be the scenario, I think, for the Southeast. Making
Lee,
sure.
do you want? I was going to say, Lee, do you want to pick that bit up, and then I can come back to Sam for the second part?
Yeah, I think what Sam said is exactly right. There's work going on at the moment to try and see how we can bring that multi-sector non-public water supply piece into the planning process more. I think, as Steve and Daniel said, there's a huge amount of work that has to be done at a very, very local level, and of course regional plans are a little bit above or more strategic in a sense. And the work that's going on at the moment is saying, okay, well, we now are starting to understand at a catchment level and across the regions where that non-public water supply usage is happening, and we're understanding where some of the pressures are, and there's lots of investigations and work going on to understand and refine the impacts. And I think the trick is getting those things to work better together. And back to Daniel's point earlier, I mean, funding's key, support is key. So the work that Steve's been doing is really key, having the right expertise and knowledge. So I think it is. I think I've seen it in some of the chats. It's how you bring this together a bit more holistically and in a coherent way. And back to where I said about WRC earlier, I think we're at an early stage, and we're really keen to see how this can build and be integrated over the next 2 to 3 years.
Thanks, Lee. I might just nip to Steve, actually, just in terms of food security. You know, we talk about the importance of, you know, food security, of food being prioritised on the government agenda. You know, around, you know, ourselves, we're very much aware of the importance of that. But for, you know, the benefit of the webinar and attendees, you know, what is the importance of water for agriculture in terms of its importance for food security?
So I mean, you know, it's obviously crop specific. So irrigated agriculture is about a relatively small number of things that we eat, but they're important. And basically for you know, putting food on supermarket shelves. So with COVID recently, we've experienced empty supermarket shelves in a way that perhaps we haven't since the 1970s. It was a bit of a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people. And it's shocking, actually, if you go in a supermarket and there's no potatoes. It is quite noticeable. So food security isn't very far away, and perhaps not as far away as people think it is. And I just listened to the previous question. What I was sort of struck by was at the base, right, and with local resource options, we're going to be able to answer quite a bit of the challenge that we're facing. But I suspect there will be a gap, right, a residual amount of demand that can't be met using local solutions or by farmers working together in groups. And at that point, if we truly value food security and don't want to import these staples, then we will be looking at you know, integrating what farmers and water companies do in a way that doesn't happen at the moment, because actually the ability to deliver strategic infrastructure really lies with the water companies. It doesn't lie in our sector. And if we're not going to go out there and replicate a whole set of infrastructure, it's really about how we use the two sets of infrastructure much more smartly. That is a big question for government. It's not going to, that kind of thinking isn't going to emerge from the base. It's going to have to be sort of driven, I think, by policy and you know, some really high level decisions around what is the role of a water company in a system of abstracting water which is climate vulnerable and changed. You know, it's quite a big thing to do.
Yeah, and I think the interesting question out of that certainly is, you know, for the future, do we see a multi-sector national water grid? And that's a webinar for another day, certainly. Daniel, I'm going to come to yourself, actually. There's a question from Tim Hopkin. Can we expand the project run at Wendling Beck with all the farmers in East of England to radically transform regional land management? And that really falls off the back of, you know, our conversation and point earlier about looking at water management holistically with land management. So, yeah, your thoughts on Wendling Beck?
Yeah, thank you. Well, can I just pick up the previous question? Because whilst we might not have a multi-sector kind of national grid for water, what I hope we will have is multi-sector strategic options which support the needs of agriculture alongside the public water supply. And WRE chairs the Fens Water Partnership and the South Links Water Partnership, which in both cases is looking at the major reservoir options we've got within our regional plan for the Cambridgeshire Fens and for South Lincolnshire, to see whether they can be integrated with kind of satellite reservoirs for irrigation. so that when the public water supply doesn't need to abstract, that can be instead be used for irrigation, and vice versa. That once you've built that kind of infrastructure, you can play tunes year to year, season to season, to make sure that everyone has the water, the needs that they have. And moving to Norfolk, clearly for Norfolk, this is a kind of question of economic growth and kind of food security, given how important the food sector is and food manufacturing is to the county. And that that's also where these abstraction reforms are starting to come through. And importantly, from a food security perspective, you need the soils, the right type of soils for those crops. You need the right climate to grow those crops, and you need the water to be able to grow the crops. And if you cut out water, you can't necessarily find that same climate. You can't necessarily find the same soils elsewhere in the country. It's not just a case of shifting farm production from the east to the west. It will probably go overseas, or it will probably go indoors. So that's where the kind of food security dimension, I think, comes in. But back to the question, sorry, that was a long introduction to Tim's question.
I knew it was another webinar, Daniel. It was another webinar.
I tried to cover it off at least quickly. Oh, sorry, and also just to say desalination. So water companies will be investing in more desalination plants, possibly for the mid-2030s, the first online plant coming forward in the east of England. And then do you scale that desal just for the public water supply, or do you allow at least some additional capacity that could meet the needs of fresh water for green hydrogen production? And also, given we're talking about Norfolk again, could at least some of that desal capacity support farm and irrigation within the region? But sorry, now turning back to Tim's question, Wendling Beck, which is also obviously in Norfolk near Durham, is one of the most, it's one of the most inspiring projects that you can come across. It's one of 4 biodiversity net gain exemplars, and from January, when biodiversity net gain comes in, we'll start to serve the market and serve credits to the market so that development can go forward in a much more sustainable way. And what's exciting from WRE's perspective is that we're working with Swallowtail Consulting, which is the team behind Wendling Beck, on another project just within Norwich, the Nature for Norwich project, funded by WWF, which is one of 6 global kind of exemplars for accelerating nature-based solutions being funded by WWF globally. So really excited about taking that Nature for Norwich project through the feasibility phase, coming up with an investable set of propositions by the end of 2024. And I know Glenn Anderson at Swallowtail and Wendling Beck has actually got lots of fingers in lots of exciting pies across the whole of Norfolk and now up into Cambridge. And if those projects come off, funded through, in some cases, philanthropy, some cases private sector sources, in some cases ELMS, then you could start to see a kind of really interesting mosaic of different landscape scale projects really coming together. And also, I've seen David Dickens on the call. WRE is working on some smaller scale projects with the Norfolk Rivers Trust to look at floodplain reconnection, to look at some smaller scale water resources, water quality schemes. And so from my perspective, there has to be a nature-based component to this water resources question.
Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. I've got one last question and then we're going to do our roundup. So the last question is, we've talked about food security, the importance of water for agriculture, for food production, the challenges that the sector faces. And, this really is a supply chain challenge. So what support is the sector receiving from the supply chain to really review the solutions, whether that be new options, whether it be, technologies, really to support food security? So if I can start with Steve, and I will run round everybody for this last question, so just to warn the others, but Steve first, please.
So for us in BAWAG, that's a good news story. So we've recently sort of set up and are delivering now quite a large technical program, and we've had lots of support from food processors in the county. Been happy to write us checks to support the work we're doing. So in Norfolk, at least, we're very engaged with the rest of the supply chain, and they're supporting what we're doing. So it's all good here.
Excellent, thank you. And that's really driven, would you say that actually once you start next year looking at those water abstractor groups, other areas can start to replicate and do very similar work, so start to look at, as a group, working with the supply chain in those areas? Yeah,
I mean, with BAWAG and our sort of colleagues in Suffolk SWAG, we have a basic models for the way that abstractor groups work. we can certainly talk about that to the new WAGs, and then of course they're free to sort of pick and choose depending on what suits them best. So the basic models there, we've got ideas for how we think that we should develop over the next few months, and it's really up to abstractor groups in particular locations to pick what's best for them.
Great, thank you. And are you aware of a water abstractor group in the Water Resources South East region? It was a question that came.
Yeah, so we've had quite a few contacts actually from abstractors in the WRSC region, and we will be sort of heading down there to try and join everybody up and sort of get them started. The other place that's expressed a bit of an interest is Nottinghamshire. So I think the work we're doing with Water for Food Group is starting to get out there, and certainly in the priority areas, I think we should be able to set these things up pretty quickly.
Excellent, thank you, Steve. Lee, just with regards to the question around supply chains and working with supply chains, do you have any comments you'd like to provide?
Yeah, I'm not sure much around that. I mean, what I would say is we've got a lot of expertise and knowledge and familiarity with how you look at these larger scale issues and challenges. So I think for us it's how we can help feed into that process and work with farmers and supply chains and just try and inform the sort of decision making and discussions.
Thank you, Lee. Sam.
Yes. Well, the Courtauld commitment is really supply chain focused. I mean, we're working with both ends of the supply chain. So the retailers who are providing funding that supports my role and the role of equivalent SAMs across the Rivers Trusts in the UK to then help deliver and engage with farmers. So there's a 3-year commitment from retailers, not only to support our roles, but also to support, in part, the delivery of some of the selected measures that we scope for and hope to deliver. So
Right.
It's
Thanks,
definitely
Sam.
there. Thank you.
Daniel, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, just again, I guess a shout out for WRE's 180 plus members, many of whom are kind of within the supply chain, thinking about these schemes, thinking about irrigation technologies, storage solutions, telemetry, water quality monitoring. We've had quite a few exciting kind of new members join us recently. But I suppose from our perspective, the supply chain is much wider than that, because I think we have to recognise the value and importance of internal drainage bores, of delivering a lot of things on the ground, which are going to solve the problems we've been talking about. Also Rivers Trusts, North Rivers Trust, but other Rivers Trusts around the country as delivery vehicles for nature-based solutions, for storage schemes that manage a range of different challenges. Catchment partnerships we've come across again today, a really important role, and potentially a more important role under DEFRA's plan for water reforms, thinking about how we monitor and manage catchments for the benefit of nature, for water quality. Steve's mentioned abstractor groups. Again, we would like to see abstractor groups spring up across the region to kind of manage these kind of shared challenges. And also, we mustn't forget our academic partners. Jerry Knox on the call from Cranfield, working with Lincoln, with the UEA, lots of academic partners to develop the evidence base to support these different options and solutions. And so, this is a collaboration, and WRE is proud to have lots of members on the call today who kind of help us through the supply chain and resolve challenges.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Before we just conclude, I'm going to try Ronald Ledbury again. The hand went down and it's gone back up again. So I'm just going to see if, Ronald, if you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question, that would be great. You've come off mute, but we can't hear you. Okay, if you want to post your question, we will answer it for you, but unfortunately we can't hear you. So I'm going to conclude. So thank you very much indeed to everybody. So we conclude our webinar today on how water resources planning can support sustainable agri-food systems. So I said at the start that the aim of today's session is to come up with 3 policy asks to feed back to the NFU and the government, and I'm going to ask each of our presenters to provide one each. Daniel, you were greedy having 3 at the end of your slide to yourself. So you've done the job. Your number 1 was to fund regional groups for multi-sector. Your number 2 was to streamline the process for local resource options. And number 3 was to support trials of nature-based approaches to groundwater recharge. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Daniel? Are we going to take those 3 forward from yourself?
No, that's a good list, and hopefully, I say, we'll have some answers and announcements in today's autumn statement.
Great, thank you, Daniel. Steve.
So my ask would be for water companies to make their WINIT programs accessible to other sectors for planning purposes.
Do you want to just, for the purpose of those on the webinar, sorry, Steve, do you want to just explain what the WINIT program is?
Yeah, sure. So the WINIT program deals with quality, water quality, and abstraction and volume, so flow and groundwater levels and all that sort of stuff. It's really the program that exists between the agency, Natural England, and the water companies, which governs water company investment in schemes to improve the environment. It's been around for quite a long time. There's a huge amount of knowledge which has sort of built up within the WINIT process, which currently sits between water companies and the regulators. We know that in the short to medium term, most of our challenges are to do with meeting current environmental requirements. So for us to be able to plan without having to replicate all of that work, if we could have access to it, then we could really make a good job of bringing agriculture into water resource management planning. It would save an awful lot of money and time.
Fantastic, thank you, Steve. Lee.
Yeah, I think a big one for me, and we touched on it a little bit along the way, is understanding the water need, the actual usage. So being able to sort of work in that area a bit more and bring that up to understand those residual risks that we have mentioned today or the residual gap in needs, so that we can help the regional work can help and support agriculture more and those catchment solutions.
Thanks, Lee. And I know, again, I think it's been mentioned, Jerry Knox is on the call, but at Cranfield, they're certainly looking at, supply demand, those forecasts, the impact of different scenarios. So as you say, it's really trying to get a better understanding of the data. And I know, Steve, you've done an awful lot with BAWAG in trying to look at that as well, and really, focusing on the data element to be able to be fully part of the conversations. So thank you, Lee. Sam.
Yeah, I think, well, there's quite a lot I could take, but I think the one I'd like to focus on is really the water abstraction groups, because that's something that's fairly embryonic down here in the southeast. And we're talking with Steve about a workshop later on, and it's something that I think would drive a more collective, cohesive action down here in the southeast. I think the water abstraction groups and having the support and the drive for that is absolutely fundamental.
Thanks, Sam. And just on those water abstract groups, is that, Steve, are people able to come to yourself? I know we've got a slide of contact details, but if anybody on the call is interested in supporting or setting up or facilitating or being part of, are they able to come to you?
Yeah, definitely. Just drop me a line and I'll help sort you out. No problem.
Brilliant. So in a moment, we'll pop up that slide with our contact details on. So if anybody wants to get in touch with any of us, then you're more than welcome to. So just as a summary, the asks that we're going to take forward are funding for regional groups for multi-sector. The second one is streamlining the process for local resource options, such as managed aquifer recharge, reservoirs, treated effluent reuse. Our third one is supporting trials of nature-based approaches to groundwater recharge. Our fourth one is water companies having providing accessibility to all to their WINEP programme. Our fifth one is understanding the need and risks of non-public water supply sectors. And our final one is the supporting of the water abstractor groups in order so that they can, or enabling them to be better part of the process. I think that's a fantastic list. So thank you very much indeed to all of the participation with the questions. Hopefully we've got through most of them, and apologies if we haven't got to them all. It really just leaves me to say a huge thank you again to the presenters. So to Steve, to Lee, to Daniel and to Sam, thank you very much. And to Rebecca and Steph as well for the technical element of putting the webinar on. Thank you. As I mentioned at the beginning, the recording and the presentation slides will be available shortly. And if you want to find out more about any of the organisations represented today or the regional or water company plans in your areas, then please do click on the logos, or please do contact those that the contact details pop up in a minute. So again, it leaves me to say thank you. Thank you for attending this session, and thank you again to the speakers. We look forward to continuing to work together across sectors to ensure water resources will be available for all. Thank you very much indeed.